With summer now ending, it feels the perfect time to hop into our next lesson. And as we kickstart year 2 of the channel, I figured it may be a good idea to talk about the start of a story, and more specifically, the events motivating our characters and pushing them to action. One of our most common motivators being death. Peter Parker becomes Spider-Man following the death of Uncle Ben. The death of his parents inspires Bruce Wayne to put on the cowl, and John Wick goes on a murder spree following the death of his dog. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. I'm sure every single one of you can think of at least 3 other examples not mentioned here. Not every motivator death, for lack of better terms, is limited to the start of a story, but for our purposes, we're going to focus on examples limited to the opening acts of an adventure. But what exactly is this video looking to accomplish? Well, as I said, death is a very common motivator, one we are all very intimately familiar with. So how do we do it right? And how do we make ours memorable compared to the 1,000 others out there? When it comes to these opening act deaths, there are 3 major questions to keep in mind. How does this affect our protagonist in their journey? What impact or connection did these characters share? And how is the audience meant to feel and connect with the moment? So let's break down each question. How does this affect our protagonist and their journey? What makes this question so vital is how many layers there are to it. There's the obvious stuff. Is our character undertaking a quest for revenge against those that killed their loved one? Or carrying the torch for a fallen comrade? Perhaps even being motivated to heroics following the death of a guardian or mentor. But then there's also the acknowledgement of the interpersonal angle, like how this affects the character going forward. There's always the dark and brooding anti-hero who won't allow themselves to form any bonds out of fear they'll be hurt again, as well as the happy-go-lucky types who are told to never lose their innocence or smile, and of course a million other things in between. In Harry Potter, the death of James and Lily leaves Harry without a sense of belonging, making it easy for Hogwarts to adopt him, and builds why his time at the school is so important to him. Meanwhile, in John Wick, the very brief moment we get before the action begins makes it clear that John is completely lost following the passing of his wife, and how that dog that she sent him helped him bring back some color to his life. This is something that goes beyond just their behaviors and attitude, though, and paints a picture of the ideals and morals these heroes carry thanks to those that came before. In the superhero genre, the supervillains our heroes face off against rarely have any ties to the death of their loved one. Green Goblin didn't kill Uncle Ben, but Ben's words still inspire Peter to keep to his sense of responsibility and stand against the Goblin. But then in series like Assassin's Creed, most of our heroes are inspired to action after the villainous Templars get a close friend or family member killed. While some assassins later ditch their quest for revenge to accomplish something for the greater good, many embark on their journey initially to seek justice for the senseless death. But it usually ends up being the good that fallen comrade was doing that pushes them to follow a path more worthy than that of revenge, as is the case with Ezio. This is why it's important in your planning to acknowledge the exact journey you want your hero to undergo. Your opening act won't give a lot of time for the character facing imminent death to leave a mark, so you want to make sure each minute spent with them helps to impart who they are and what they stood for. Now, yes, you can use flashbacks to reveal more as the story unfolds, as many do, but make sure you lay some groundwork. For example, if the hero's father was all about hard work and honesty, it could be used to explain why the hero has such a hard time lying, even if it would be best in the moment. Now this can also work in the sense of the mean-spirited mentor. In the Mistborn book series, Vin spends a lot of the Final Empire reflecting on the words of her brother Reen, who constantly belittles her about making friends and how she needs to be ruthless. Whenever Vin feels uncertain, Reen's voice is there to tell her not to trust anyone, and causes some trouble for her throughout, as she constantly fears that she'll be abandoned for being weak. While most of the book makes it appear that Reen had ill intentions, it's later revealed toward the end that he'd been doing all this to protect her, and was simply trying to keep her safe, a lot of his words being recontextualized to show that he was simply being over-paranoid and protective, and his claims she'd be abandoned weren't threats, but fears. So on to question 2, what impact or connection did these characters share? So this mixes with what was mentioned above with the Mistborn series, and is truly important for the early moments when the character is still affecting the hero of the story, and the exact moment of their death. With a majority of these deaths, they're happening too soon for us as audience members to truly connect and share care for the character. Yeah, it was sad watching Uncle Ben die, but the emotion of the scene wasn't really from losing Ben, it was from how the death affected Peter. A great writer will make the audience share the emotions of their hero, and get us to feel the same impact as if we'd known the characters just as long as our hero did in the universe. And a large part of that comes from making us understand how important this character was to the hero. We're looking to invoke the emotions Luffy felt when Ace died, and not the lack of emotions held by Luke Skywalker following the deaths of his aunt and uncle. We already talked above about using every minute to impart who the character is, wanting to ensure the audience understands their ideals and how these ideals have been shared with the protagonist. But making the character a walking textbook of moral wisdom kills any emotion we'd be able to garner from the scene. And this is where we need to make sure we give this character some meat. Reflecting on Uncle Ben from the Raimi movies, early scenes show Ben to be a handyman, and the brief conversations shared between him and Peter show that they regularly work together, and give us a real sense that these two are close up until the spider bite starts to change Peter and his behaviors. In going beyond just Guardian characters, war movies and games aren't a stranger to killing off the brother in arms, giving an early scene where characters discuss what waits for them back home before the brave soldier gets themselves killed to protect the protagonist. And agency is never a bad thing. A character with their own dreams and goals, perhaps sharing a similar goal with the protagonist, or at least sharing their passion, is a great way to show the loss that's felt by the hero, and possibly give that same feeling to the audience. And that brings us to point 3. How is the audience meant to feel or connect with the moment? As mentioned above, our main goal is to get the audience sharing the emotions of the main character. Realistically, you're not going to get people to care deeply for a character they've spent only a few minutes with. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. I still remember the way Last of Us players collectively lost their minds over the opening sequence, when Joel's daughter is gunned down by the military checkpoint while trying to flee the city. A large deal of the props does have to go to the utter heartbreak we get via Joel in the moment, but this death just floors you. It seems to come without warning, and does what so many others have failed to do: shock the audience. Now let's be honest here, shocking the audience is a very dangerous game to play, which is why I always err on the side of caution with point 3. Personally, I do think it's more important to relate the death to the protagonist, and bring life to their emotions in a way the audience can share that grief. But sometimes, a character's death can elicit raw emotions from the audience without the catalyst of the viewpoint character. But do it wrong, and you end up with Carl Grimes from The Walking Dead, a move that tanked viewership and killed thousands of viewers' interest in the series going forward. Now, on the bright side, with an opening act character, you're very likely safe from the same fate of The Walking Dead. But what you do risk is creating an impactless death. Death is an interesting tool in writing, and some fans love series where it feels like anything can happen. But if the death feels empty, it'll paint a bad picture, leaving fans thinking you either don't respect the characters in your world, or worse, could lead to a Stranger Things fiasco. The popular Netflix series is often criticized for how predictable it's been, as only the newly added side characters are ever in danger of dying, as there hasn't been a single death faced by the season 1 main cast across all 4 seasons of the show. So, eliciting a good audience reaction to an early death, how do we do what The Last of Us pulled off? Video games of all things seem to have the best handle on this. And surprisingly, one genre of gaming I see pull it off well time and time again is none other than the anime gacha games on mobile. This video idea actually spawned back in April when I downloaded Goddess of Victory, Nikke. What appeared to be a goofy and very anime-styled game really took me by surprise when, before even walking out of the opening chapter, the character I originally perceived as our main heroine was gunned down. Games do have a slight advantage. Since most tend to be tens of hours, some even more, their opening acts tend to range across a few hours, Nikke's opening chapter probably running a solid hour in itself. And Nikke starts by introducing us to the character Marian, a character I believed was intended to be our female protagonist. She's our first playable unit, introducing us to the world and story, and has perhaps some of the more natural interactions with the commander role that players assume through the game, not only making her death shocking, but heartbreaking. But Nikke had to pull this off. First off, our protagonist is us. we're technically filling that role, and seeing as the entire first story arc and first 20-ish hours revolve around Marian's corruption and death, players needed to be invested from the opening chapter in both her character and story. And I was. These types of games usually get my interest for a couple weeks before I ultimately forget about them and move on. But Nikke's hook was so good, I'm still regularly logging into an iPhone app 4 months later. And what Nikke gets right is Marian is a character with her own agency. All through Chapter 0, her interactions paint her as the right-hand woman to our player character. The pair partner immediately and have the same goals. She has these little quirks and bits of characters that peek through, leading to the question that we as writers can only hope to achieve once a death occurs. Now what? The best reaction that a writer can get from a death is an audience that wonders what happens without them. Characters like Marian and Sarah from The Last of Us are regularly brought up even today in their respective communities, with people wondering how events would unfold had these early moments played out differently. Now, yes, Nikke fans will point out Marian's death wasn't exactly permanent, but at the time it was a major twist, and one many fans have accurately described as a solid punch to the gut. Given what I described above, you'd be forgiven for thinking, well, that all sounds easy, I'll just give my character a goal and get the same reaction. And this is actually where we have to be careful, but not from the sense you might be thinking. Funnily enough, the real worry isn't creating an easy to forget character, it's creating a hard to forget one. In The Last of Us and Nikke, despite devastating fans with these deaths, players remained with the game, because these deaths were necessary and played out in a way that despite being sad we lost these characters, we knew the story was better for it. But what happens if you kill off a character that seems to play worse for the story, like Carl in The Walking Dead or Laurel in Arrow? Again, I don't think we'll see as negative a reaction as those received, as we are still playing with newly introduced characters. But what we do need to be wary of is what we're promising in our opening act. One of the most important factors to starting a story is the promise we make to our viewers. Every piece of media promises an experience, and our audience comes in expecting the experience they paid for. So if we lead people in with the promise of a buddy cop adventure, and then kill the buddy almost immediately, it can lead to some trouble. Now, of course, like the buddy cop example above, this is easily remedied by introducing a new rookie partner and building antics between the gruff veteran and the new rookie. But what happens if the chemistry just doesn't click? Going back to Nikke, one of the things that was so heartbreaking about Marian's death was that her chemistry with the player character had been done perfectly. But the Nikke team is quick to fill the void, pushing the true main heroine quickly into role and building a strong bond between the player and her. But if that chemistry falls flat and doesn't land quick, it'll spell trouble. Chemistry is an interesting thing to play with. It isn't always sunshine and rainbows, but there's clear signs to characters that mix and those that don't. And if your replacement hero ends up being worse than the one we lost, it's going to sour your viewership. Alright, now before we wrap, there is one thing I should probably mention. I'm sure we've all encountered this at least once. The montage of the supermodel giggling in lingerie and reminding the gruff assassin type that he can be a normal human too. Only for that sunshine and radiance to be skewed to darkness and blood. Fridging is the poor side effect of this technique. And contrary to what every blue-haired ultra-liberal on Twitter will tell you, killing a female character to motivate a male isn't immediately bad, but it very well can be if you do it wrong. At its worst, the term fridging refers to a wife or girlfriend of the main action hero dying a horrible, gruesome, and bloody death to send him on a path for revenge. But the big problem here is the character serves no purpose beyond being a body. She has no personality, no agency, and no character whatsoever. In these cases, she's really no more than eye candy, meant to be oogled by the audience before her death. You'd honestly be forgiven if you thought she lived in the protagonist's bed and never left it. And this is where the death as a motivator trope becomes a problem. In dumb action movies, sometimes the reason for the senseless violence just isn't as important to the audience as how cool and bloody the fights can be. But even if you're looking to just make cool action movies, it doesn't hurt to get a better sense of storytelling and character. and your work will always be remembered far more fondly when your characters matter and leave an impression. Current storytelling and content consumption has seen an interest in character-driven stories. People love characters. Modern audiences practically basing parts of their personalities off their favorite heroes, which isn't always a good thing. But with character being important, and so many viewers coming and staying based on their love of the characters, there's no harm in finding purpose for those we'll lose. Trust me, your work will be better for it. It's great to be back from this little summer break, and I'm ready to get right back into it. This next leg of videos is really going to focus on starting the development of your story. And so, with that, next video we'll be discussing something that was mentioned earlier, the importance of your promise, and how we can make sure we set in stone what audiences should expect from your story before we get too far in.